Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Freethinking podcast. My name is Scott Olson here with Dr. Tim Stratton, and today we are going to be finishing up our long series on the free will show, which has been a lot of fun, a lot of good clarifying discussion, and also their podcast is just really excellent. So I'm glad that we're able to refer our own listeners there.
Amen to that. Taylor Sear and Matt Flummer have become two of my favorite guys. I'm now interacting with both of them on social media and in some groups with them, and I'm learning from them. They're sharpening me like iron, and I'm just honored to know them and to learn from them.
Yeah. So last time we were discussing a Frankfurt style case, which we talked about Frankfurt style cases a couple episodes ago. So if that word confuses, honestly, you're just better off watching these one after the other. So if you are liking what we're talking about, just start from the beginning and you'll be fully caught up and you should know what we're talking about. But
Yep.
I'm not going to explain what a Frankfurt style case is. I will briefly lay out what the Frankfurt style case was that the questioner laid out. And then we're going to hear some thoughts from Taylor about what he thinks about this particular case and whether or not this agent is morally responsible. So the questioner says, imagine a Frankfurt style case where the agent contemplating two courses of action, say one blameworthy and one praiseworthy, chooses to carry out a morally blameworthy act and does so of their own volition. But the observer both knew what the agent was going to do and directly manipulated the circumstances surrounding the agent in order to bring about the desired result without directly manipulating the agent's thought or directly forcing their hand. According to semi-compatibilism, would the agent still be morally responsible? Should the agent be punished if the one carrying out the punishment for the blameworthy act is the observer? And so Taylor says,
unless what's happening is the observer is taking away the agent's options and the agent knows this, so they're doing what they're doing because they couldn't have done otherwise. Like if that's happening, well, then I think the semi-compatibilist should say, no, the agent's not morally responsible.
Right. Yeah, I agree with Taylor on this point. He's brilliant. if someone causally determines an agent to not have metaphysical, epistemic, or actual access to alternative possibilities, then the agent is not responsible, at least in a desert sense. Indeed, this is very similar to my case for rationality. After all, if someone or something else causally determines an agent to affirm a false belief, then better or true beliefs, they've been metaphysically or epistemically closed off and blocked away from the agent's actual access, right? Even if it doesn't seem like it to the agent, even if the agent's not aware of this. But if that's the actual case, even if the agent doesn't know it, then the agent is not responsible for his affirmation of the false belief. So I don't think it matters if the agent knows this or not, as Taylor mentioned, as long as it's ontologically true that someone or something else has metaphysically blocked off or locked away all other thought options, evaluations, or courses of action, then the agent, the person being manipulated or causally determined here, is not responsible in a desert sense for his thoughts or actions. If he does not possess actual access to the correct or right thoughts or actions, I don't see how he can be held responsible. So this is one reason I believe to reject any exhaustive deterministic view, because if exhaustive determinism, just ED, is true, or if exhaustive divine determinism, EDD, is true, then something or someone else is responsible for the sins of humanity, not humanity. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think it does. And I think that's a really good point. All right, so Matt says,
the times where I've heard this brought up before is in cases of like God being the manipulator. Yeah. He sets up the universe in a certain way. if determinism is true, then he knows exactly what's going to happen. He sets it up in order that certain things happen. And one of those things happens to be a blameworthy action from a person. And then he punishes that person for the action that they performed that God knew that they were going to do.
Yeah, great point, Matt. Again, this also needs to take into account that on EDD, God also causally determines each person to possess the exact kind of nature that would be causally determined to react to causally determined circumstances as well. So we're talking about the entire show if the exhaustive of Ed is true. So it seems obvious that a human should not be blamed in a desert sense for the nature that God causally determined him or her to possess. They are just as blameworthy as the liquid water that turns to ice in freezing conditions. But should ice be punished and held accountable for its actions of turning? Should H2O be punished and held accountable because it has a nature that freezes in freezing conditions? Of course not. That's crazy. It's ridiculous. However,
it depends if you're talking about ice of water or the Immigration Customs Enforcement.
You always have to get political. Come on. Let me bring it back here. That's another episode we'll do. All right? Table that, bracket it. We're going to talk about that later.
All right.
Because I love politics. But yeah. All right. Let me just say this. If God created human souls to possess a nature that is free to choose among or between a range of alternative options, each of which are compatible with human nature in circumstances where the antecedent conditions are insufficient to necessitate or causally determines one's evaluation or judgment or choice, then it seems that we are the kinds of things that can rightly be held blameworthy for wrong thoughts, incorrect beliefs, or sinful actions. So I do think, I can't be blamed for having a nature that is that's free in a libertarian sense to think and weigh options and to be careful or not careful while thinking. All right, I can't be blamed. God just created me that way. But since he created me that way, and I do have the opportunity to take my thoughts captive, according to 2 Corinthians 10:5, or to let bad thinking take me captive, according to Colossians 2:8. Right? There's that implies two different courses of thinking, each of which are compatible with my nature. Right. And so I think that is something supernatural about us. I think that's the best way to explain it. I'm willing to hear other options, but I do think that this is a supernatural ability. And this is why we are blameworthy, unlike liquid water turning to ice in freezing conditions.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that whole mystery type of thing just a little bit. So I will save my comments till then. But then Taylor goes on and says,
there is this difference. If this is a regular Frankfurt style case, or at least close to one, and all the observer's doing is just monitoring, they haven't really intervened to affect things, I tend to think, they're in a position to blame just as much as anybody else would, right? Just because they watched and they were ready to make sure that the person did the thing. Yeah, if the person's still to blame, then I think the observer can blame.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Taylor here. If the agent is not causally determined in thought or action when the agent makes his choice, even if the agent cannot do otherwise because the observer would have intervened to make sure things didn't go otherwise, right? Even if that's the case, so the agent needs to be a free thinker in a libertarian sense. Even if the agent cannot actually physically act otherwise and pull the otherwise off. Again, let me point to Loki on Disney Plus. The first episode's just amazing. And I'll just say this: if a scenario like this is the case, as I've argued, then ed Calvinism can't be true. The word exhaustive, the E of ed, does not allow it. So the agent must be the proper source of thinking, evaluating, judging, and choosing. And again, this seems to be perfectly illustrated, with the new Loki series. So yeah,
Tim,
Disney they need to start paying us.
I don't know. Well, paying you, I need to watch these shows.
Yeah.
But I'll take whatever cut they're going to give me.
All right.
They're a rich company. All right. So the final question, I believe it's the final question that we're going to. Nope, there's one more. Just kidding. Psych out. There are 2 questions left. The first one is, how do you factor incomprehensibility into your thought on free will? How ought we think in light of the fact that we are trying to answer questions that can't be solved?
Yeah. Well, I think these problems have been solved. I mean, perhaps I'm too optimistic. I am kind of an optimist, but I do think we can know that we have libertarian freedom, and also know, at least have a really good idea of how it's possible to have it, how it's possible to have this libertarian freedom. But I tend to think that people, they give up too quickly. They start punting to mystery on second down, to use a football illustration. I'd rather go for the touchdown on 4th and inches. And even if we fail, we still have the other team in horrible field position, and we have an awesome defense. So, but yeah, I feel like
100% agree.
Yeah, you agree.
Just even purely from a football perspective, like mathematically, that makes so much more sense.
Right.
Field goals are punts with a participation trophy. So
yeah, it just drives me crazy to see people just punting to mystery really early, not trying to do some hard work and think through these things. Now I'll say this: appealing to mystery is much better than affirming logical contradiction or affirming a low view of God. So we've got to avoid both of those things like the plague. And we ought not affirm a contradiction and then say it's just mysterious how 2 propositions that are mutually exclusive are both true, right? Don't do that. I mean, when you start doing that, that's a nice way of shouting to the masses that Christianity is not true. Because if something's true, it's going to be logical, right? Truth and logic are inextricably linked. You can't have one without the other. So, and by the way, we are commanded to be reasonable in Isaiah, right? I end most of my blogs that way with Isaiah 1:18. Come, let us reason together, says the Lord, right? So God is telling us to reason, to be reasonable, not to affirm incoherent, 2 incoherent propositions or mutually exclusive ideas, right? We have to be reasonable and logical. So yeah, sorry, that's my sermon for the day.
No, it's all right. Okay, so a couple of things. Like, one, it is interesting, just the last thing you said, it made me think about, there's a number of different ways people will assess positions in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. And, in a number of, if you read a lot of philosophical material, one thing a lot of people will say is like, oh, this particular issue is a cost to this theory. And what they mean by that is, doesn't necessarily mean the view's false, but it does force you to affirm something that makes it less likely to be true. For example, a lot of times views that say there are these brute facts that just have no explanation, that is a cost to affirm on that theory, as opposed to another theory where they don't have to do that. There's a much more elegant type of explanation for it. Now, just because that one affirms brute facts and the other one doesn't, that doesn't mean necessarily that view is better than the other one. It just says that the view that affirms brute facts needs to be better significantly in other areas than the other view, and explain more things that make it more better to hold. And all of these types of ways of speaking about positions, they are ways that we try and get closer and closer to truth. So in the same way, appealing to mystery is a cost to a theory, because it's saying, well, we can't really explain how this is, but that is better to do than saying, well, my view leads to a logical contradiction. Well, that is certainly a cost to a theory. And some people would say, well, that makes the theory too, let's say epistemically expensive to hold in my mind. And so I need to affirm this mysterious view as opposed to this contradictory view.
Yeah.
And so, but again, like you say, if we have two views, one which appeals to mystery and one which doesn't, we ought to prefer the one that doesn't appeal to mystery,
Right.
all the other things being equal. Now, maybe there are other reasons to prefer the mysterious view, but those need to be hashed out. But in terms of this one particular view, that's kind of how you would think about these types of things. Now, a good example of this from a Christian perspective is the Trinity. I think the Trinity is not a logically contradictory concept, but it is mysterious because we have nothing else really to compare it to, which, again, isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, if we believe God is who he says he is, then it would make sense that he is unique in terms of all of his creation. There is no one like Yahweh. That's what the Old Testament always says. So that would make sense. So just because we can't really come up with some kind of elegant explanation or like an analogy, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. It just means, oh, it's mysterious, but that's not enough to say it's false. You'd have to show some kind of logical contradiction. So I say all that to say free will can be mysterious in certain ways, in the sense, even I think we said on the very first episode, there's some kind of supernatural, almost miraculous power that we have to just choose something that wasn't determined by antecedent events and other people or other things outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
Sure, you can say, how does that even make sense? You can say, well, I don't really know, but there doesn't seem to be a logical contradiction in affirming it. And so me saying that's just a mystery, I'm fine with living with. And I think even you, I mean, you're saying that you don't like punting to mystery. And this isn't necessarily me punting to mystery, but it's just saying that, sure, there are questions that are in Super Bowl for us to think about on free will. And one of them is, how can somebody do these things? How can we just almost spontaneously, I suppose, choose something and that be, a meaningful type of choice? Maybe there are, well, I don't know exactly how, but the benefits of holding this view in terms of how it explains everything else in the world far outweigh the cost of, I'm not sure how exactly this works.
Yeah. I sometimes you might have to punt to mystery. What frustrates me is when people are punting to mystery on second down. You still got two more downs left to play.
Or if they're affirming a logical contradiction and then they're saying it's just a mystery.
Right.
Because I'm like, no, that's not how this works.
No, you got to throw the flag on that.
Yeah. Because that I see sometimes as well. It's, well, this is just a mystery how this works. I'm like, well, if I've shown a logical contradiction in your view, you can't just say, well, it's mysterious how my view contradicts logic.
Right.
Well, I guess you can say it, but I don't know where else to go.
Yeah.
From
no,
there.
that's a 15-yard penalty or 50-yard penalty. I don't know. It's like you should just lose the game as soon as you do that.
I'm just like, okay, great. Well, I guess have fun.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you'll hear from people saying, well, how does God possess his middle knowledge? I don't know.
Because he's God.
Because he's God. It's like, how does God create the universe from nothing ex nihilo? Yeah. I don't know. But there's nothing incoherent by saying that God is all powerful and can create physical matter from nothing. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing incoherent about saying that God is omniscient and knows how free creatures within his power to create, how they would freely choose if he were to create them. And even if he never does, there's no logical contradiction there. Right. But then to say, well, how is God omnipotent or how is God omniscient? I don't know. I don't know that. I'll punt to mystery, but that's people.
Or how does the mind interact with the brain?
Yeah. That's something I've been thinking about. I think I might have an idea.
Okay. I mean, like I said, though, the mystery doesn't mean we'll never figure this out. It just means it's not a like, because you don't have to have everything about your view figured out before you're able to hold a view, because otherwise nobody would be able to have views about anything.
Right.
Which maybe the world would be better then. But yeah, so it's like mystery is mystery is only really a cost to a theory if there's an alternative theory that's just as good as your theory on all these other things and doesn't also have to hold to that mystery.
Mhm.
Then that's when a mystery kind of becomes a problem
Yeah.
for you. And I think that's probably the best way to think about it. But I just totally blanked on what I was going to say. I had another great thought. It was going to be wonderful. And I'm just kind of going on a Trump rant right here. Is wonderful. Probably the best thought you've ever had. Believe me, no one has thoughts like me. All right, we're
That's
leaving
good.
that in.
That's good. All right. Sounds good to me.
All right, let's get to this last question. And that is that many, if not most, discussions of free will seem to presuppose the outcome, namely that there is such a thing as free will. So we must figure out how such a concept can exist in light of science, logic, theology, etc. This seems to be a rather unusual way of understanding something. From my point of view as a scientist, the first and most important question is whether or not free will exists independent of the consequences and our basic intuitions. All questions related to morality or other implications are downstream and should not rightfully enter to deliberations on whether free will is real or illusory. Phrased another way, there are two questions that should be kept separate. A, does free will exist? B, how could free will exist given what we think we know about the world, logic, God, etc.?
That's a good question. What's great about the free thinking argument is that it centers around abductive reasoning, which is central to science and vital for a good scientist, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone assumes they possess opportunities to infer better and true beliefs over false ones, at least if they're careful. So, think about it like this. Loosely and roughly speaking, the argument could be phrased like this. You could say, premise one, if humans do not possess libertarian freedom to think, then humans cannot engage in science. 2, humans can engage in science. 3, therefore, humans possess the libertarian freedom to think. So if one assumes that we can engage in science, and I think that's a good assumption, then it follows that humans possess libertarian freedom. Now, the next question arises, but how can we have libertarian freedom given that, or at least given what we think we know about the universe? Well, this depends upon other assumptions, right? If one assumes that things that are other than nature do not exist, as Alvin Plantinga has said, naturalism is the view that God and things like God do not exist, or God or things like God do not exist. So if one assumes such things, if one assumes that God or things like God do not exist, then one has a big problem. But if we have reason to think that God exists, which we do, we have a cumulative case and multiple reasons to think that God exists, or at least that he probably exists. All right, then we have no problem with the idea that things like God could also exist, which the Bible makes clear in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. So, yeah, what do you think?
Well, I was a little bit curious about his question. It seems to me that, wow, that was such a Dr. Craig line right there. I'm a little curious about this question, like just when he's about to just destroy the guy, which I'm not claiming to do.
You're just claiming to be like Dr. Craig.
Exactly, like the two foremost philosophers in Christianity today. But it was interesting to me because he says that many, if not most, of the discussions presuppose that there is such a thing as free will. First of all, I don't know. Maybe that is true. I'm not as involved in the circles as you, but it seems to me the question of whether we have free will would be, I don't know. Maybe that's not debated anymore. Maybe it's just kind of assumed. But I guess he might maybe he's not as familiar with the literature either, because the reason why we assume we have free will is because it makes really good sense of a lot of the existing data. Like one of the things you say is we seem to think we can engage in science. That would indicate we have, at the very least, some type of freedom. to like rationally affirm new beliefs. We seem to believe that we have morality, or that morality makes sense, and that like we can be genuinely responsible morally for things. That seems to involve some sort of free will. And so I guess he says as a scientist, he would want to, I would imagine he's looking for some kind of physical evidence of free will, which I don't know that you'll necessarily find that, especially if free will, as you and I have talked about, is some kind of supernatural concept. It seems that science would be the wrong tool. But at the same time, science is not the only data that needs to be explained. I think a large part of most philosophy is figuring out how to explain our intuitions about things. And like really it gets messy when people share different intuitions about the same thing. But it seems with free will, most people do share very similar types of intuitions, in the sense that, oh, we have something that is like free will. And so I guess from my perspective, it would be wrong to just say, hey, what's the scientific data for this? Which I'm not necessarily saying he's saying that as his question. That just seemed to be what he was getting at. But rather, there's all sorts of data where free will of whatever kind you want to affirm would be the best explanation. And then from there, we're saying, okay, what type of free will would best explain this data?
I think I'm tracking with you there. And when you say what type of free will would best explain this data, that's, I think, that's where I spend most of my time, is trying to, it's got to be libertarian freedom, a non-causally determined type of freedom. You can't be causally determined by something or someone else and have a kind of freedom that really makes a difference here. And so that's what I call this libertarian freedom to think.
And what you're saying is, hey, compatibilistic freedom doesn't explain the data.
Right.
Either doesn't explain the data, or it doesn't explain it as well as libertarian freedom does. And so that indicates, hey, we probably have libertarian freedom, because it's just it explains more and it explains it better. So
I like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is it for us on this particular series. Tim, did you have anything else you wanted to finish up with?
No, this has been a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to what Taylor and Matt do on the Free Will Show. I think their next season is going to be talking to scientists who step into these philosophical issues as well. So that's going to be interesting. So I want to encourage people to make sure you subscribe to their podcast and to their YouTube channel. Make sure you listen. Make sure you go listen to their first 2 seasons, and then listen to this next season coming up. And Scott, they're probably going to give us more things to talk about. So I look forward to that.
I'm looking forward to it as well. And one more, I did want to clarify. I'm not saying science has nothing to say about free will. That wasn't my point. I'm just saying it's not the only thing that we should consider when discussing free will. But I'm sure y'all get that. Cool. That is it for us. We will talk to you guys next time on the Freethinking Podcast. Peace.